So I'm Hannah McGlade. I'm a Noongar person from Perth, West Australia, and I've specialised in human rights for Aboriginal people and international human rights law.
Today being the 9th is the International Day for the World's Indigenous People. Can you tell us a little bit about the significance and importance of that day?
It's a day the UN have nominated some years ago to highlight Indigenous people across the world, and particularly the human rights issues and struggles that Indigenous people face. For many years, there were no real standards in international law, no specific standards anyway, and Indigenous people across the world lobbied the UN as a group, part of a group called the Working Group on Indigenous Populations, to develop an international instrument to promote Indigenous human rights. And that's now been supported by the Australian government for a decade. It's the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There was actually one convention previously called ILO 169, which Australia did not sign, which concerned Indigenous and tribal people. So this is a big day because we have so many human rights ongoing struggles and violations that have arisen since colonisation and the history that we haven't still rectified.
Can you tell us a little bit about your work and the work of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues?
Mm-hmm. So I am a Senior Indigenous Research Fellow at Curtin University, and I'm a member of an Indigenous group that's across Australia called Indigenous Peoples Organisation, or IPO. And just as an active member of the Noongar community, I have been engaged in human rights advocacy for more than 30 years now. My mother was a Noongar activist in the 1970s. That was a time when we had absolutely no land rights or no native title. And in fact, we hadn't even in Australia signed some key treaties prohibiting race discrimination, for example. So I have been thoroughly raised in the Aboriginal rights movement, and I do work where and when it calls me, because unfortunately the human rights issues are quite severe for Aboriginal people. My particular areas that I've been working in most recently involve state violence or structural violence to Indigenous people, and it's not really an issue that people recognise readily, that non-Indigenous people recognise. And Indigenous people are frequently speaking out about this issue of systemic structural discrimination. And in fact, we're talking about violence by the state. And while we have protested the issue of Aboriginal deaths in custody for a long time, and the issues around incarceration, which are extremely high, the other area of concern is to do with the removal of Aboriginal children from their families. And whilst that did gain a lot of attention in the 1990s as part of a national human rights inquiry called Bringing Them Home, what we've seen since then has been a steady increase in the rates of removal of Aboriginal children. And there are a host of human rights issues being thrown up by these patterns of actions by the state against Aboriginal people that I advocate for. I support court action sometimes, and I write about these issues as well to increase understanding in the academic and non-Indigenous society.
And what work does the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in particular do around those issues in Australia and more broadly across the world?
Well, the UN Permanent Forum is there to allow Indigenous people across the world to have a voice and to highlight injustice and human rights violations, and promote the declaration and the standards of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this is my first year as an expert member, and I was nominated by the IPO to represent the Pacific, but I'm there in an expert capacity. That's what we have been told. We had a very interesting, my first meeting was in Finland, in northern Finland, this year, hosted by the Sami people. And we met in the Sami Parliament of Finland, actually, and we were fortunate enough to meet the Sami Parliament presidents of also Norway and Sweden and learn about the struggles and issues facing Sami people. Now, every year, normally, the UN will hold its permanent forum meeting in April. We had to cancel, obviously, with COVID, and there's been a severe disruption across the UN agencies. So we're conducting work by meetings, by VC meetings, and generally meeting with other agencies. So I had a very good meeting last week with the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Children, and raised issues about Aboriginal child removal, and also the very highly traumatic experiences that many Aboriginal youth are having in out-of-home care, and in some cases actually resulting in them having early deaths before they go to live an adult life. So this is really an opportunity, the forum, to be networking as well and engaging with other UN bodies to highlight and improve human rights around the world. Normally we'll also do some issues papers. So I hope to do an issues paper on, I'm quite interested in Indigenous political representation, especially as we don't have any national political representative body in Australia, Indigenous.
Mm. Can you talk us through, you've mentioned a little bit there and in earlier answers about the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. What does that declaration contain?
Well, there's quite a host of articles or provisions in the Declaration, and covering different areas of issues. For example, political participation and leadership and self-determination is one of the key rights that Aboriginal people and Indigenous people across the world have been fighting for a long time and fighting for today in Australia. And it basically means that we have a right really to determine and lead the way in regards to key issues that affect our communities and cultures. And we have had that right denied to Indigenous people in Australia since contact and colonisation that took place without a treaty. And unlike the US or many parts of Canada, where oftentimes the treaties that were entered into, say in the US, did guarantee the Indigenous people internal sovereignty and self-determination, Aboriginal people in Australia were really robbed of that right. And laws are always made for Aboriginal people which are not in the best interests often of Aboriginal people. And we can see that today with the Closing the Gap targets, which show still great inequality, and the way that policies and programs being devised by non-Indigenous government departments are failing to meet the needs of Indigenous people and close the gap. But there's a great diversity in the articles, in the Declaration. So, for example, we have the right of Indigenous people to have our own media. That's really important. You wouldn't think that would be necessarily in a UN document, but Indigenous media is so critical for Indigenous people to have our own voice about our own issues and to promote our own music and culture. So the delegates that were drafting the declaration put that right in there, and I'm glad they did. And we have some government support for funding Indigenous broadcasting in Australia. There are other rights, for example, that say, about protection of heritage and culture. And we can see this is a big issue in Australia today. And there's a Senate inquiry underway about the blasting of a very significant site in the Pilbara area, Juukan Gorge, by the multinational mining company Rio Tinto, in disregard of the Aboriginal heritage implications, and that's a long-standing issue. So that's an important right that's in there. Those rights are also expressly stated to be guaranteed to equally to men, women, children and youth. And that was included because, the Aboriginal women who were drafting knew that actually sometimes in our own communities there's discrimination also against women and children and youth. So I encourage everyone to have a look at the declaration. We need to make it more accessible. A lot of people, I think, still don't know. I wonder how many students coming out of high school do actually learn that we have a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And I wonder actually if many university graduates, even in important courses like social work, where they often might go on to work with Aboriginal families, actually know about the Declaration and what it means, because in practice we hear a lot of stories in that sector, particularly where Aboriginal people's rights are really not actually being respected.
Mm. You've had quite a lot to say about the age of criminal responsibility in Australia. Recently, the Australian Councils of Attorneys General have decided to defer a decision on whether to raise the age of criminal responsibility in Australia above 10 for at least another year.
Mm.
And that's been raised as having human rights issues. What are your thoughts on that particular decision?
That is such a glaring human rights violation for Australia, that little children, you know, at 10 could actually be put in prison and are being put in prison. And I think we need to learn more about how often this is happening, you know, what are the children being convicted for, and the impact that it's having on them. We know that children, certainly we you know, shouldn't be holding them responsible at such a little age. And I was at a school event last week at the Aquinas Boys College, and I saw very young boys in front of me, but they were not 10, they were like 12 and 13 and 14, but they still look so incredibly young to me. And the thought that, you know, children are of this age are being put in jail is very hard to fathom. And we know that a lot of the kids that are committing these so-called crimes really, they're not, you know, they're not able to exercise proper decision making. Sometimes, very often, they are living in poverty. They are maybe homeless. They may be hungry. They may be living with trauma and violence and abuse. These are all very frequent factors in their life, and to actually incarcerate them for these misdemeanors is really really highly. I wonder what the right English word is here. Is it egregious? I'm a self-taught person, so I actually learnt a lot of words from reading rather than actually hearing words. So, but you know, it's just obscene. And I have been before some of the UN committees advocating this issue, and the last meeting of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, who were reviewing Australia and pointing out to the Australian government, you've got one of the lowest ages in the world of criminal responsibility, and it's largely Indigenous children. And of course, we know Aboriginal people, that is why the age is so low, because it's not generally non-Indigenous or white children being impacted here. It's Aboriginal kids, and that's why, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement has been so powerful, because it's raising the issue of how people, Indigenous people, Black people's lives are treated as if they don't matter, and even children's lives are treated as if they don't matter in Australia. Unfortunately, it's you know, it is so traumatic, I believe, for the children, that we are harming them profoundly at the level of their brains, which are still growing, and that we are, you know, potentially creating a disability on the part of children by punishing them in this way and locking them up. The Australian Medical Association of Peak Body, you know, for medicine and health issues, has absolutely condemned it, and there's been a national campaign, and still the Attorney Generals could not find the decency and the dignity and the wisdom to just do the right thing, even though all of the United Nations human rights bodies are also saying to them, you must increase the age, and that really 14 should be a minimum age of criminal responsibility. So we must increase this momentum. There is a momentum across Australia on this issue, and the film, the documentary, was showed in Geneva at the Human Rights Council last year, in My Blood It Runs, with the main actor showing his life. He actually spoke. He was the youngest boy to speak at or person to speak at the Human Rights Council. And I'd like to actually see schools, you know, there's so many schools that have signed on reconciliation agreements, it would be great if the children could take this campaign further now.
Hannah McGlade, I know it's a very busy week for you, so we really appreciate you taking some time out of your day to have a chat with us here at UN Youth.
Thanks very much.